It has been a very difficult 2 weeks in our country when it comes to loss of life, whether it be the deadly mass shooting at Brown University or the horrific murders of Hollywood icon Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle Singer Reiner, to the loss that we may have felt in our communities or even on a personal level, from the loss of a loved one, a job, a marriage, or grappling with a national tragedy like a mass shooting or a natural disaster. It is painful and it's raw. And the timeline to get to the healing phase of grief is different for everyone. And those feelings and triggers that we go through are typically exacerbated during the holidays. I wanted to talk to an expert about steps that we can all take to help ourselves and others get to the light at the end of that tunnel. But before we unpack all of that, if you like this kind of content, don't forget to hit subscribe. Joining me today to discuss this is author, motivational speaker, and life coach, Angela Wynette. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You know, grief is a landscape that everyone is going to have to walk through at some point in their lives. And I understand that it looks different for everyone. Can you talk about first the 5 stages of grief and what those stages could be for people? Does everyone have to go through each one specifically, or is it just tailored to the individual?
It's really tailored to the individual. The 5 stages, you have acceptance, denial, anger, depression. And it really, it just depends on the individual because some people, depending on the circumstances, will determine their outcome of how they go through those stages. Some people, they are caught off guard. It's unexpected to lose a loved one or to lose an animal or a job or whatever. Grief looks different in very different settings. And so when it's unexpected, it hits people harder than it is when you kind of have time to prepare for it. And even though you have time to prepare for it, it still doesn't take the sting out of it, but you're a little bit more settled and your mind is able to cope and come to, recognition of this is the process. We're finally at that stage that I knew was coming, so you have a little bit more time to process, to get yourself quicker to acceptance than those who just wake up and this happened to them. And now they're having to wrap their mind and grapple with the effects of what has happened. So their acceptance level takes a little bit longer than others.
What could happen if one doesn't allow themselves to move through whatever pieces of the 5 stages that they need to get to acceptance?
It's something that I always tell people: when you don't allow yourself to go through the process and you cripple yourself, really, because it becomes a ripple effect in your life. So it becomes something that begins to display itself in all forms of your life. You can become angry. You can become detached. You can become, to a place where you're closed off and you shut the world out and you push people away who are actually there to help you. But because now you have this jaded type of, outlook on life, you now see things from a different lens and everything becomes an unhealthy view, for a better way of putting it, to where now you see everything from a damaged lens. You see everything from a depressed lens, from a hurt lens. And it's hard to find the good out of the day. It's hard to find the good in others. It's hard to see, the great things that are happening in your life because you're so consumed by what has happened to you.
And when someone is consumed like that, I'm do they even realize that they are that deep into where they can see that I'm viewing this from a damaged lens? I'm viewing this with in a jaded way, and are there signs that once they are going through that they can kind of pick up on that? Okay, I'm not dealing with this in a healthy manner, because sometimes, as you mentioned, it can be all consuming.
Right. Some people, yes, can recognize it when they go from being an outside, naturally bubbly person. They're such an extrovert to now they're an introvert. They don't want to be around others. They don't want to answer the phone. They don't want to go out. They just lose the light that they once were within themselves. And some people can recognize that and they'll say, hey, I'm not myself right now. Give me time. I'm trying to process this the best way that I can. And then others, because it happens so quickly or it consumes them so badly that they don't even see that they become aggressive, that they become angry, that they become, to this standoff, push off point, to where sometimes we have to bring it to people's attention. And it's not even intentional sometimes. It's just, unknown to them. they've caught themselves in this cycle that it's hard for them to get out of. And so when you bring it to their attention and you bring it to the forefront and you start to identify the signs and say, hey, friend, you're short with me, or, you don't answer the phone, you don't really want to accept help, is there any way that I can be of assistance to you? It looks different for different people. Some people become sad, and every time you do try to give them that olive branch, or that remedy to try to help them, it's an automatic shutdown. It's an automatic pushback of, no, that's not going to work for me. Oh, you just don't understand. You just don't get it. And so again, it's just different for everyone. And there's different signs, like I said, they can become aggressive, they can become angry, they can become closed off, so it just depends on the person.
That's such a touchy subject. And I think that a lot of people have been on either side of that coin,
Right.
where you've been the person that was experiencing a type of loss. And you can tell when people, they kind of don't know what to say to you. And then we've been the person where you really see someone who is struggling and you want to talk to them and broach that subject, and then you don't know what to say. So,
Right.
so I guess the question is, how do we approach this?
One of the best things that I've learned with just personal life, with myself, with others, is the best way that you can start off is just asking, how can I be of assistance to you? What does that look like? Because in that moment, you may not want me to say anything because you're not in a position to receive anything that I am trying to offer for you. You may just want me to sit there with you. You may just want me to be like, hey, can you just pray for me today? Can you just force me to get out the house? Can we just go get some tea? Or can we just go walk outside? Or just showing up, whatever that looks like for them, whether it's coming to the house with some ice cream and let's just sit here and cry together, and watch your favorite movie, or whether that's, let me help you find resources and look up with you counselors that you can go speak with. I'll even attend the sessions with you if that helps you feel comfortable, until you get to a place to where you're strong enough mentally to want to go on your own. So there's different ways that you can be of assistance. But the main way I always tell people is to ask them what that looks like for them. Because in our mind, we can feel like we're being helpful. We can feel like we're saying the right things. And to them, they're like, you're irritating me, get out of my face. Even though you have good intentions, but for them, that may not necessarily be how they need the assistance. Sometimes they may just need that random text message, I'm thinking about you. I'm here if you need anything. And that may be what gets them through the day versus you calling and lecturing them about how they need to do things differently.
What do you think as a society we still don't understand about grief and then the way that we approach it?
I think that we try to make it a blanket type approach, that we think it's just this one thing of, oh, take your time and then get over it. And that's not always how that works. And then we think it's supposed to be a certain time limit. And that's not always the case. Some people, it may take them more than a year. It may take them more than 5 years. It may take them, just a couple of months. And so that looks different for everyone. And I think sometimes we get caught up in, it's been long enough. Why are you still crying? Why are you still upset? Why are you still, acting like this is just the first time that this has happened? When again, that looks different for everyone. Losing a child that you have birthed is different for a mother versus that sibling who grew up with that person. Everyone's grief is different depending on your connection with that person and how they were to you and, how they impacted your life. Growing up, if your parents were your everything, and we know that this has to happen, we know that they're eventually going to go because that's a part of life. But when it happens, that still doesn't make it easy for you, whether you were anticipating it or not. And so I think we have to stop lump summing people of how long or how it looks like how they should be grieving, because it looks different for everyone and the timeline is different for everyone.
And that's an interesting point because it is true. One does not want to feel if they're still 2 years from the loss, they're still feeling it because there could be triggers.
Right.
You could see a picture of the person or a situation, a scenario that you were once in, or a song that comes on, and it brings up all of those things. So I'm glad you mentioned that the timeline is different, so people can understand that their process is their process. How does one deal with those type of triggers as they're moving through grief? getting to the
Um,
healing?
honestly, especially around the holiday times, that's a big trigger for people because that's usually when you gather the most with family. You have these certain traditions that you have established with your loved ones or your friends. And so that emotion kind of hits even heavier during this season. And so one thing I try to tell people is instead of looking at that as such a heavy marker of they're not here, try to find a way to honor them. Find a way that whatever that grief is for you, find a way to honor it. Find a way to find light around it, whether that's going and giving back to shelter or going and volunteering at a hospital or going and sitting into, a group setting and counseling and speaking to them, telling them your story and about the different levels that you've gone to how you've gotten to where you are now. There's different ways of approaching that. And so I think that it looks different on a wider scheme when you come to how to address that and how to go through that. And those triggers for you, again, like you said, can be a smell, can be a song. And when you know that you're possibly going to encounter that, there's also ways that you can protect yourself. They always say protect your peace. Certain settings, if you know that that's going to be too heavy for you, if you can avoid it or if you can minimize that encounter, then do that. That's okay. It's not you running away. It's not you being afraid or cowering out of a situation. It's just you learning how to maneuver in that space that works best for you while protecting your emotions and your feelings at the same time.
I was wondering also about when it comes to familial grief and when you're dealing with a situation where there are also young children who are experiencing the same thing. So I wanted to ask you first, as we get on that topic, do children experience grief the same way adults do in terms of how they are going to move through that? Because we know they're operating in a different way.
Right. Yes and no. It really just depends on the age of the child and their concept of what has taken place. If they're older, preteens, even 8, 9, 10 years old, and they grew up with this certain person, whether it was a parent, a sibling, a friend, grief can very much be so much real for them as it is for an adult. As far as their processing, they may not know how to articulate how they're feeling or put it in words per se, as far as this is my emotion. They may act out. You may start to see them have behavior issues in school, and they were once this great child that was quiet, that got along and had straight A's. And then all of a sudden now, they're not doing homework. They're skipping class. They're talking back to the teacher. They act out in different ways to where the same as in adulthood, you may act out towards your friends and lash out and tell them they don't get it, they don't understand. And so for children, grief the process is the same for them as well, depending on the age. The younger ones, they may not necessarily comprehend when you're 2, 3, 4 years old. All you know is that you once saw this person or you once were around this encounter and then now you're not. And they may have these random questions of, well, where is so-and-so? I miss so-and-so, and it may hit different for them, and it's weird how that happens because so my little brother passed away and he was 19 years old and my niece and nephew were not yet born. And so they did not get to encounter him, but it's crazy because once we started to introduce them to him, it was like they already knew him. And I was like, okay, how do you guys know him? And it was like they had this special connection with him and we couldn't explain it. And it was one season where my nephew went through this crying period and he would just burst out crying. And I miss Uncle Aaron. But you never met him, And so we couldn't explain it, but it's that phenomenon of showing that there are things bigger than us, they're greater than us, and that there is life beyond now, and that they can encounter them, they can experience them. And so it's funny how grief happens for somebody who hasn't even, physically met someone, but yet feel a connection with them. And he's only 6 years old,
Right, because on that note, we open that doorway to that energy to be let in. To where like they start to become familiar with someone, so that when that person's essence, their presence does cross over and they're around, and even a child that's never met them can feel that love and that energy.
Right.
And also letting them know that that's okay to feel. Right.
that it's normal. It's not weird. You're not crazy, for seeing people or, a ghost as, they may want to put, it's like, no, that's a safe energy. That's a safe space. That's a safe person. This is somebody that loved you, still loves you, even though you didn't get to encounter them, but they're watching over you.
Right. And on that note, we're kind of veering a little bit, but I was thinking about my father who I lost some years ago. And there were times when I could definitely feel him around, but specifically his specific cologne. There are times where I've had whiffs. I mean, I'm not even whiffs. I could smell his cologne in places where there was no one else around, and that shouldn't have been there.
Right.
And sometimes we get those feelings when we've lost people. We
Right.
have those experiences.
Right. And sometimes those are just, if, again, depending on your connections to them, those are just those gentle reminders that I'm here. I
Right.
may not be here in the physical, but I have not left you. I'm still close by. You can still feel me close to you. So when you have those moments where you're missing them or where you need that reminder that, they're watching over you, you'll get those signs like that, or you'll have those encounters.
Right. And back to the children and the relationship to the adults around them.
Mhm.
Oftentimes when they've experienced a great loss, there's going to be one or a couple of people, but people often try to let me take care of this person first
Right.
and make sure everyone else is okay. But then they really haven't sat down and processed things for themselves. Can you talk about why it's important to, one, make sure that you're okay so that you can be there and present fully for others? And also, what kind of damage could be done if one puts themselves last in that process and they're really not dealing with what they need to move through to really get to the place of the acceptance and healing?
Yeah, most definitely. So, watching my parents go through that experience, my dad is a pastor, has been all my life, so it was for them leaning into the spiritual side for them. We're very religious and spiritually connected. And so watching them having to lean on that faith and then also giving them that space to say, you don't have to be my pastor right now. You don't have to be my first lady. You can just be my dad.
Mhm.
You can be my mom, and it's okay to cry. You don't have to hide that from me. You don't have to conceal that from me. I don't need you to be strong in this moment because I get it. And so as that adult, sometimes, again, depending on the kid's age, sometimes the kid can help in that process of just presenting that space of, it's okay to cry, mom. It's okay to cry, dad. And because I know that they feel like they have to protect them because they know that they're hurting as well. And so they want them to know that it's okay to hurt. But at the same time, they want them to feel like the parent has it together, because in our mindsets and our culture, we have been conditioned that the parents are supposed to be the ones that's supposed to set the standard. They're supposed to set the tone. They're supposed to set the example that, you're supposed to be okay. We can get through this. Everything is going to be okay. But it's okay if it's not in that moment. We're humanistic. And if you're sad, it's okay. Give yourself that time. If you don't want to expose it to your children in that moment, take that time to say, you know what, I need a moment. Go to your room, close that door, or take that car ride, take that 30 minutes to decompress, to get your feelings out, get your emotions out. If you're a writer, I tell people all the time, journal it. Write it down.
Mhm.
That's one thing that I always like to refer to, because writing certain emotions down and then going back a year later and looking at how far you've progressed from where you were then to how you're writing now, and how your emotions have changed and how they've matured, and how you've been able to go through certain seasons. That's another good tool. So for parents who are, I mean, just adults and like even for those children who are having to bury their parents now, lean on your siblings, and then know that it's okay if you're that strong one, because I'm the dominant one in my siblings. Unfortunately, they call me the mom of the group. And so I know they lean on me a lot, but I have
Mhm.
to always remind myself to give myself permission to be okay with not being okay in that moment, to take those moments when they arise, to not push them to the back, and to not, for lack of a better word, lie to myself that I'm okay when I'm not, and allow myself to be honest with those feelings in that moment, and give myself that space. If I need to disconnect for 2 days, guys, because I need a moment to get myself together, then
Mhm.
I allow myself to have that. And I'm honest with them about that. I'm fine, guys. I'm okay. I just need a moment. and we can respect that with each other. And then at the end of the day, check in. Okay, are you good? Do you need anything? How can we be of assistance?
There's been a lot of things going on in the country in the past week and a half, I would say. We have seen for example, the Brown University mass shooting.
Yes. Yeah.
We saw in Australia the Bondi Beach mass
Yeah.
shooting. The Rob Reiner and his wife, their horrific murders were,
Yeah.
and there are things that and I bring that up to say that sometimes as a country or or your community, if there's something tragic that happens, even if you don't have a direct connection, there's still some sense of a grief that you do feel like there are times where you kind of tap into that, even when you don't know people, to where you do feel a certain sadness. Can you talk about that and ways that people can process that? Because I feel like because of the age that we're in, we see all these things that happen and we're bombarded with the news of what's going on. And sometimes we feel those emotions.
Right. Especially in this past year alone, it's been heavy. It's been
Right.
heavy for a lot of people. I've had several friends, several clients that have come to me and said, I had to get off social media. It was too much. It was just taking on everyone's opinions and their views was too much. And so being an empath myself, I take on everyone's emotions, and I have to learn how to compartmentalize that and just be like, okay, Angela, like, you're allowed to sit in that for this session, give yourself 30 minutes debrief. And then we have to push, like we have to find a way to navigate that space to where it doesn't overtake you. It doesn't consume you. And in today's society, unfortunately, since, social media is big. And so
Right.
it highlights and it magnifies certain platforms where you wish certain things were not shared. But because everyone wants to go viral and everyone wants to be the first to report something and everyone wants to be the first to show us, it makes things a little bit more insensitive. And I think to a certain degree, we've become desensitized because we've seen so much tragedy, because we've encountered so much, mass shootings and stuff, especially when it comes to the schools and stuff, that's not a norm. That should not be treated as a norm. That should not be something that we just be like, oh, there's another one, that's not thing we should get used to. And so finding that time to just be able to compartmentalize our emotions with that, give yourself time to process it, because yes, you want to keep up what's going on in today's world so that you can know how to maneuver and how to, navigate when you're out in certain settings. Let me be aware, let me be on guard, but at the same time, give yourself space to detach from that too, to not find yourself to where that's all I'm streaming every day. That's all I'm wrapped into, because it will consume you and it will have you paranoid. And it would have you, just overly frantic, and you look at life and you're all of a sudden now you're just scared to just live regular life, So I'm gonna say, take those moments to experience it, express it, talk about it with those that's your safe space, but then also give your moments to say, okay, now I have to kind of give myself a break from that, because I don't want to become jaded, or I don't want to become over, reactive to certain things, or I don't want to become in a space to where, I'm emotional and then it's like, okay, this is consuming me to take on and I can't even form, normal duties anymore. So take yourself time to, process it, to experience it, because it is heavy, it is hard. We don't wish the atmosphere that we're in on anyone in this world. And, but then at the same time, find ways to compartmentalize that so that you do not get in a space to where it overtakes you.
That's good advice. And you're right. It's been I was mentioning the last week and a half, because there's been so much, but it has been the year. It's been, I've talked to a lot of people that they just feel that heavy atmosphere that you're talking about. It feels heavy. And if you're an empath, you are going to, we feel things deeply, we feel it more. And it seems that much more overwhelming.
Yeah.
Right. And so going back to just I guess the individual, when you're going through the processes of grief and loss, when do you kind of realize that you're approaching acceptance, one, and then healing?
That's a good question. It's kind of like this wind of fresh air, to where now you can wake up in that sense of heaviness that you once carried. that sense of burden that you once carried, when you see their picture, when you hear their name being brought up, or when a certain memory or smell or song appears and you don't follow, part of the scenes, that's kind of your indicator that, you're not getting over it, but you're now in a place of, you're coming to peace with it. You're able to accept it. You're able to hold that in a positive manner now, and it not be so heavy for you. It not be something that just the thought of it now breaks you down, to where now you're in a space where I can speak about it and I can laugh and I can smile and I can rejoice in the time that we had together. I can, find the joy in the memories that we have. And I'm okay with sharing those memories, whether it's posting something on social media or sending a text or looking at old photos or old videos, and I can hear your voice and it brightens my day now, instead of sending me into a whirlwind spiral because I miss you so much and I wish I could talk to you, And so you just find yourself in a different space. You find yourself in a different headspace, in a different emotional space, and your atmosphere becomes different. Your outlook becomes different. Your mentality becomes different. You're more uplifted now.
And so, what are we touched on this earlier, but I wanted to kind of just specifically talk about that. And maybe I should have asked you that first, in terms of the and I know it's very individualistic, but the best tools to get to that place that we just talked about, to where you can now see someone's photo, or look at a scenario or a song, or and it doesn't send you into a tailspin. How do we get there?
Again, that's different for everyone. Like I said, it's not necessarily a blanket response
Yeah.
to that, but there are steps that you can take. The first one is acknowledging what happened, acknowledging your feelings, acknowledging that you're hurt, that it did hurt you, that this did affect you. And once you become honest with yourself, then now you're in a space to be like, okay, now how does that process of healing look like for me? Does that look like me taking some time away and taking a leave from work so that I can process my feelings? Does that look like me going to counseling so that I can speak to someone about taking the necessary steps and tools of how to be able to, navigate this space? Does that look like me leaning on family members and friends more, becoming more vulnerable in this space and admitting that I need help? That I need assistance, that I can't be by myself right now. I may need somebody to come stay with me, or I may need to come stay with someone else, and just finding those necessary ways that work for you. But first, acknowledging what's going on. And then after you acknowledge it, then put a plan in practice, put a plan in place for you of what grief help looks like for you. How does that look? Does that, like I said, go to counseling? Does it mean joining a support group that I go check in every Tuesday and Thursday in person, or am I on Zoom with someone? Am I picking up books, that help me navigate that space, and, help me journal, or, workbooks that help me go through this and how to compartmentalize my feelings, and then how do I pick my circle? Who's my safe space? Who can I go to in these moments that help me instead of hindering me, because they listen to me instead of inflicting their views on how they think I should be handling this? And then once you go and put that plan in place, now it's time to have that action. Let me be realistic, give myself a timeline. I always tell people, when we give ourselves timelines, we kind of stick to it because now we have a goal. So be realistic and say, you know what, hey, I don't want to see myself sit in this space in 6 months. I don't want to see myself sit in this year, a year from now. And so try to give yourself that timeline of keeping yourself on target, of working towards actually getting to that healing. And then once you get to that space, then you'll start to see yourself get there. You'll start to feel yourself get there. You'll start to see the change within yourself. And then that's kind of like the simplistic steps that you can take. It's more in depth, again, depending on the person, but that's kind of the simplistic, steps that you can take to help get you to that process to start that healing and acceptance.
How does someone know they're in trouble? Because we're talking about recognizing when you're rounding that corner, and I understand there are some people that they may not get there, or they may have trouble getting there. When does someone recognize that they're in a very dark, precarious place?
Oh, there's several signs for that. I had several clients where, after just speaking with them, and I learned that their habits changed. how they speak about life, your living space where you were once this clean, organized person to now you're stepping over things because you don't have the desire anymore. The depression has overtaken you to where, you're not necessarily filthy, but at the same time, you're not as organized as you used to be. You don't care about that basket of clothes that's sitting there and you just keep adding to it or pulling from it. Your habits have changed. Your eating habits have changed. If you once used to work out all the time, now you don't have the desire. That's how you can see someone that it's consuming their life and it's taking over them. Again, if they become aggressive, they become angry, and you try to talk to them, you were once able to just laugh and have little silly comments. Now everything is sensitive to them. Now everything is personal. Now you're coming for me, you're attacking me, you're being mean, you're being insensitive. You begin to see a different version of these people, and they may not necessarily see it of themselves. They can feel it, but oftentimes we may not always want to be honest with ourselves about, I'm struggling. You want to sleep all the time now. You don't have the desire to go out. You don't even want to watch TV anymore. You want to just sit in silence. You don't even want to open the window to have the fresh light come in. You're okay with just being in the dark all the time. Those are different signs where people are in this space, whether they recognize it or not, because it may have gradually come and happened to them, or it may have been settling. But those are things that you can recognize with someone to be like, hey, are you okay? Because I'm seeing these different traits in you that you didn't always possess, and I know that something traumatic has happened. And so I don't want this to become your new norm. So how can I help you? Do you want me to come over and help you get the house back organized? Let's have a cleanup party. Do you want me to start coming with you and let's go walk for 30 minutes outside every day together? However that looks. But, sometimes it may be hard for them to identify the gradual changes that are coming over them. And so that's where we can help them by kind of just pointing it out in a loving manner, with also offering solutions on how to help them get through that space.
I was watching I believe it was a TED Talk, and the topic was grief and healing. I believe her name was Nora McInerney, and she said, "We don't move on from grief; we move forward with it."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a very true statement and an interesting way to put it. I wonder if you could expand on that in terms of what she meant.
Yes. So with grief, you don't get over it. People always just say, oh, you'll eventually get over it. You'll move on. You don't move on. You learn how to move forward, as she stated, in that space of learning how to navigate now in this new norm. You now learn how to cope with the person not being here. You come to a sense of understanding, a sense of acceptance with that. And so now you have finally gotten to this place where, instead of, like I said, instead of me breaking down and crying all the time, instead of me being consumed by my thoughts and my feelings, constantly having to go to the grave site and visit their, grave every day, you now get to this space to where you've developed a new norm. You still think about them. That void is still there. That emptiness is still there. But now you're able to carry that in a different space to where you're able to still go on with life, and it not be so heartbreaking for you, it not be so consuming for you. And so this new norm now allows you to move forward, even with that absence of them, but still accepting them in that space of where they're no longer at, and loving them for the time that you did have with them, while being able to give yourself permission to create those new memories and spaces in the space that you are now.
And on that note, just to wrap up our conversation, for those that are going through the stages of grief right now, and they want to get to that place of healing, what do you say to them to just, it's almost like being a cheerleader for them, to what's their motivation to keep going? There's light at the end of the tunnel. What would you say to them?
Give yourself permission to feel what you feel. Be honest with yourself. If today is a heavy day, acknowledge that. Be honest about that. But then also give yourself space to feel like it's okay. It's okay to move forward. It's okay to create a new norm. It's not dishonoring them. It's not, slighting them in any form of fashion. It's not forgetting them. For that widow that wants to move on, it's okay. For that mother that wants to have another baby, you're not replacing what you lost. You're just now filling that space with something new and giving yourself permission to be able to have those new experiences. And it's not a detriment to what was. It's not a dishonor to what was, but it is now honoring them by saying, you were there, you gave such a great space for me. Now I know that you would want me to move forward. You would want me to move on. You would want me to be in a happy state and not just sit in depression all the time, not just sit in this emptiness all the time. And so give yourself permission to know that it is okay to move forward, that it is okay to accept something new, and that's not in any way sliding or taking away from what once was.
Angela Wynette, thank you so much for joining me. That's very important information.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.